You know, I tried to come up with a nice, clever opening for this video on Joss Whedon, but I actually think the man himself said it best.
Nobody ever fell from a pedestal into anything but a ditch.
Well, here we are again. I suppose it was actually a bit optimistic of me to think I could make it 3 whole weeks into the new year before having to talk about this kind of nonsense. So, Joss Whedon, once the clever king of nerd culture, after about a year of keeping his head down following a lot of nasty allegations, has popped up again with an interview and accompanying article in New York Magazine. As a super quick refresher, things started going south for him when Ray Fisher, the actor cast by Zack Snyder to play Cyborg in Justice League, spoke out about alleged unprofessional behavior and bullying on the part of Whedon on the set of the extensive Justice League reshoots that Whedon oversaw after Snyder initially left the project due to a personal family tragedy. From there, things snowballed as co-stars like Gal Gadot, Ben Affleck, and others came forth with their own stories or stated their support of Fisher in that particular conflict. Then, a whole bunch of older stuff, both known and new, got rolled into it as incidents on the sets of shows like Buffy got brought up, most prominently by Charisma Carpenter, and in a similar pattern, others came forth either to voice their own stories or to show their support and their belief in Carpenter's statements. Those in the industry defending Whedon seem to only be stating that they personally didn't have issues when working with him, but even some of those stated that they could believe the kind of stuff that was coming out about him. Whedon stepped down from show running The Nevers on HBO ahead of its series premiere and officially for creative differences. He hasn't really been seen or heard from since, until now. If you want more complete details, well, we'll be going over some of it, but I also talked about this at the time. Should be a link up there. So this article has not gone down well with folks. We're going to be looking at some of the reasons why that is, and I'm going to do my level best to not let my own feelings about the man or any of the things that he is going to be saying over the course of this to seep too much into things, because honestly, a lot of what we're going to be talking about speaks for itself, especially when placed in proper context. I do, however, want to address a couple of things just as quickly as I can. The day the issue of New York Magazine came out happened to be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And for those outside the US who might not know, it's a celebration of the iconic civil rights leader who fought for racial, social, and economic equality. Now, this led to a lot of folks on Twitter saying something to the effect of, real classy of Joss Whedon to slam a black actor on Martin Luther King Day. And yeah, it was a bad look, and we'll get to what he said about Fisher in a little bit. But the man's not responsible for the publication date. The interview was actually conducted months ago, and he doesn't control the publishing schedule of New York Magazine. I'm not trying to defend him, but let's save our anger for stuff he's actually accountable for. Just saying. The other thing I heard more than a little was people saying that they thought the article written by Lila Shapiro was defensive on Whedon's behalf and seemed to be trying to paint him in the best light, at least somewhat sympathetically. And I'm not sure I agree with that, although this isn't a hill I'm actually prepared to die on. Personally, though, the general tone I got off the thing was that it was something Shapiro really wished she didn't have to write. But to my eye, it didn't come across as trying to be overtly sympathetic towards Whedon. Most of the instances doing things like calling into question the motives of Whedon's critics, again, we'll get there, they were framed as being the perspective of Whedon or of his defenders, and it didn't seem to me like the journalist was actually taking that perspective herself. Again, not to me, anyways. Though, like I said, I'm not so confident in this perception that I'm going to wag a finger at people with a harsher view of the article's tone. I'm more airing this out as a way of explaining why I'm not going to be diving into that angle very much on all of this. What I will grant is it is strange how much the article talks about Whedon's hardships growing up at the start of it, talking about his childhood and his pre-career life, almost as if the original hope and intent was to have more of a general profile, but then the issues of the last few years basically overtook the entire middle and most of the back end of the article, which again, for me, lent to that feeling that Shapiro had hoped the article would take a different shape than it ultimately did, especially as the article tries to bring the whole thing full circle towards the end, seemingly not realizing how far away things drifted from the sections talking about his initial pulp culture impact. Again, this felt more confused and at odds with itself than actually protective of Whedon, but that is my read. Others have felt differently. I've stalled long enough. Let's get to it. I'm going to be covering the issues that are brought up in the article largely chronologically, as that's actually the format the article itself is mostly following. Now, as noted, there's some rather extensive verbiage related to Whedon's childhood and his education, and then it gets into the days of Buffy, Angel, Firefly, and even Dollhouse. There's a very telling quote from Miracle Laurie, who worked on Dollhouse. She was largely positive in what she had to say about Whedon, but then she also added this.
I saw his kindness and his good intentions, but I also saw the snarkiness, the fickleness, where I would not want to be on the other side.
And that kind of illustrates what I said before about those who had good working relationships with Whedon still seemed readily acknowledging about the darker sides of his personality, even if they themselves weren't ever the target of them. And it's noted by Shapiro in the article itself that this dual defending of one's direct experience while acknowledging the harshness of the man was very typical of the people she spoke with in the lead up to the interview. Now, please note that as we move forward, some of the people that get quoted in the article gave their names, some did not. I will note a name if it appears in the article, but many of these stories come from unnamed sources, and it would be up to readers or viewers in this case whether or not they have faith in New York Magazine's vetting and source verification process. I think they have a solid enough reputation on that, but we'll move forward from here. Let's start talking about those who experienced Whedon's harsher side more directly. This is where we get stories like that came from costumer Cynthia Bergstrom, who said that during a disagreement on costuming,
he grabbed my arm and dug in his fingers until his fingernails imprinted the skin, and I said, "You're hurting me."
A writer on Firefly recalled a story where Whedon was unhappy with a script turned into him, and rather than give private notes, he called a meeting of the writing staff and proceeded to tear apart the work as if he was giving a lecture on how not to write. The TV writer who told the story, who isn't the same one who was being belittled, recalled it thus. It was basically 90 minutes of vicious mockery. The guys were looking down at their pages, and this woman was fighting tears the entire time. I've had my share of shitty showrunners, but the intent to hurt, that's the thing that stands out to me now. Another member of the Buffy production team touched on Whedon's affairs with some of his actresses, which, quick note, is something Whedon has never denied happened, though the identities of the actresses has never been confirmed by anybody involved. The staffer told a story about working in her office when Whedon and his lover came into that office and began making out, despite the staffer's presence.
They would bang into my chair. How can you concentrate? It was gross. These actions proved he had no respect for me or my work.
The article then goes on to bring up what were the big Buffy era stories that came out when the controversy was peaking. There was the apparent on-set rule that Whedon was not ever to be left alone with young actress Michelle Trachtenberg. This is a story that the article appears to verify, with one of the sources noting that the rule existed, but Whedon himself may not have actually been aware that it did. Now, this whole thing appears to stem from a closed-door meeting between Whedon and Trachtenberg during the filming of Buffy Season 6, which the source said left the young actress, quote-unquote, shaken. Exactly what did or didn't happen in that meeting is unclear and isn't something I'm going to be speculating on, but The rule appears to have been put into place in the wake of that. And then, of course, there was Charisma Carpenter, whose issues with Whedon on the sets of Buffy, and especially its spinoff Angel, are well documented and were known prior to all this, but they came up again. And again, I went into more of this in that video that I linked earlier. The short version is that Carpenter seemed to be increasingly stressed by Whedon's work manner, leading to increased tensions that peaked when Carpenter became pregnant, and Whedon was, let's just go with unsupportive for right now. Whedon denies the specific allegation that he called a pregnant Carpenter fat, though a story from Buffy writer Rebecca X, who wrote for the show as Rebecca Rand Kirshner, talks about encountering Whedon while she was pregnant sometime after the show had ended, and his reaction to seeing her that way was, "Oh, you're fat." Shapiro apparently spoke to Rebecca X multiple times, in person and over email, and noted how she appeared deeply conflicted about her experiences on Buffy with Whedon in particular. As Shapiro put it,
she alternated between criticizing Whedon, questioning her reasons for criticizing him, and questioning her reasons for questioning those reasons.
An example of this comes in the form of her answering her own question about whether Whedon was ideal at giving writers notes.
No, he's a blunt instrument, but I'm a very delicate receiver.
On the topic of these stories and others about the difficulties of working under him during his showrunning days, Whedon had this to say.
I was young, I yelled, and sometimes you had to yell. This was a very young cast, and it was easy for everything to turn into a cocktail party.
Despite that acknowledgement, he contested the specific accounts on the subject of grabbing the costumer's arm.
I don't believe that.
The staffer in whose office he was making out.
That seems false.
His handling of Carpenter's pregnancy.
I was not mannerly.
Okay. Before we get into any further details of what's in the article, I need to take a minute to just talk about how Whedon was responding to questions about these incidents. Honestly, the big question that I found myself asking at this point as I went through the article was, what is he hoping to accomplish with this? I'm not entirely sure what I was expecting, but standard practice for these sorts of things is either a full-throated denial of everything or an all-out mea culpa and plea for a chance to be better. Whedon isn't really doing either of these. Or rather, he's kind of doing both, or at least he's trying to. While Whedon is offering up denials of some of the specifics, he's freely admitting to fault to the general tone of the criticism being leveled at him. And even those denials are very soft. He's using words like believe or seems and appears to be very careful not to flatly call anyone a liar. And if you think I'm supposing too much self-awareness on Whedon's parts, one of the very first quotes from him in this article is this.
I'm terrified of every word that comes out of my mouth.
He seems very aware of how thoroughly examined anything he says is going to be and is trying to walk a very fine line as a result. But I'm not sure why he thought that would do anything to help. If he'd doubled down, for instance, and insisted that he never did a single thing wrong, he probably wouldn't have alienated any more people than he already has, and his defenders would have clutched to those denials and just rallied around him. If he'd offered anything approaching an actual apology rather than these tacit admissions of wrongdoings, maybe a few folks would be tempted to give him a second chance, but by doing neither one, it just leaves the situation as is. Or rather, it would if it weren't for some of the later quotes that we're going to be getting to. This whole aspect is infuriating because, to my eye, at least, Whedon is displaying just enough self-awareness that it makes me annoyed that he isn't more self-aware than this. He doesn't seem to lack the ability to introspect, but just doesn't appear to be doing it very well. It'd almost be easier to swallow if he had zero self-awareness, or at least it'd be easier to write the whole thing off. And it's worth noting here that Shapiro notes several times, following some of the more direct questions, Whedon would excuse himself to the bathroom, something he would later admit was a trick he used when asked an uncomfortable question. So in some of these instances, he excused himself, thought about the responses before giving them, and this was what he decided to say. But okay, let's get back to it. As I noted earlier, the identities of the numerous women Whedon had affairs with has not been disclosed. And that fact alone may have been part of what kept Whedon from being ostracized back in 2017 like he is right now. Because you see, back in 2017 was the year that Kai Cole, his ex-wife from whom he separated in 2012 and officially divorced in 2016, she put out an open letter with details about Whedon's infidelities amongst other things, again, without naming names, talked about it at the time. Had the women involved ever come forward to tell their side, it's quite possible the specifics of the power dynamic or how these affairs started, evolved, or ended could have been catastrophic for Whedon. Not that Cole's letter had no impact. It was the point at which many people started to turn a more scrutinizing eye to the once lauded Joss Whedon. But without the details on the affairs, people were left to decide for themselves whether they were going to choose to believe the best or the worst of all possible scenarios. But of course, there was no way the article could just skip over the subject. So when Shapiro broached the topic of the affairs, Whedon expressed instant regret, though in some frankly bizarre ways. He noted that it messes up the power dynamic, which, okay, I mean, that's not untrue, but it's a very strange thing to focus on, given that he makes no mention of regretting that he betrayed his wife's trust. The wording is also really strange because, yeah, in workplace affairs, the power dynamic is kind of at the heart of it, especially in a situation where powerful men having an affair with someone over whom he holds a great deal of sway when it comes to their career. Yeah, power dynamics matter. But the way he says it seems more like he's concerned with how the power dynamic is affected by having the affair, not about how the power dynamic affects the existence of the affair in the first place, which generally speaking is the much bigger issue. I know it seems like I'm reading a lot into a quote that isn't even a complete sentence, but I kind of have to in order to prep you for what's coming up. Whedon went on to say that he had to sleep with these women and that he was powerless to resist. I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. I kind of have to, because it's such an outdated notion in the vein of, wasn't my fault, officer, look at how she's dressed. It feels like parody. Shapiro clearly thought so because she writes in the article that she tried to laugh it off, to which Whedon replied,
I'm not actually joking.
This is where some of the earlier sections about Whedon's youth actually come into play, because what appears to be going on here is that he was surrounded by the kinds of beautiful young women he never had luck with when he himself was a young man, and he felt compelled to pursue them because he felt he would always regret it if he didn't. Now, I know I said I was going to try and not bring too many of my own feelings into this, but this is where I'm going to start breaking that guideline, because the degree of tunnel vision required to see other human beings first and foremost as opportunities that he either misses or grabs rather than as people in their own right. Look, I want to say it's unbelievable, but I'd be lying if I said that, because it's not. It's familiar. Unsettlingly familiar. It's something I've witnessed, and if you go back far enough into my own life, it's something that I've thought. One of the things I've been working on the most about myself for going on 2 decades now is to not treat people or think of them as supporting characters in my story, because they are their own person with their own story, not a bit player in mine. And you might think that would incline me to be more understanding of Whedon, but the truth is, if anything, it makes me judge him more harshly, because that's a part of my own life and history that I do not look back on with any degree of kindness. And I would be quick to point out that during my worst stretches, I was a dumb 20-something in college and then entry-level jobs. He's a professional in his 50s talking about the things he did while being a television showrunner in his 30s. Because I recognize the thought process, I also recognize the deep level of self-delusion it takes to think that way. And I can only imagine what it takes to state those feelings years later with no acknowledgement of just how twisted the thinking was in the first place. So, getting back to the article. While Shapiro didn't interview any of the women who had affairs with Whedon prior to his separation, she did speak with 3 of them who'd had intimate relationships with him in the wake of that separation. And all 3 had some very unflattering things to say. One woman, a freelance writer who used the pseudonym Sarah for the article, talked about how he'd led her to believe that he was single and then set her up to go out drinking with a friend of his who he said he wanted her to meet. And over the course of that conversation, the woman told Sarah that she was dating Whedon and had been for enough time to consider him a long-term boyfriend. Then there's television writer Aaron Shade, who Whedon paid to come to his house and, quote, watch him write, on the condition that she not inform her bosses. The pair then dated in secret for nearly a year before she slept with him, and soon after that he broke up with her over email. Last year, Shade detailed the entire affair in a 7-part YouTube series, the playlist of which should be in a video link right up there. And then there's Arden Lee, author of The New Rules of Attraction, which was a book about being a female pickup artist. And it does appear that she was the one who initially picked up Whedon, and the two then began a relationship from there. And they kept things going to some degree for about 3 years, at which point Whedon broke up with Lee a few hours before her birthday. Now, that already isn't great, but I mean, breakups happen, and there isn't really an ideal time to break up, right? Yeah, about that. In the epilogue of her book, Lee had recounted that one of her worst memories ever was a boyfriend breaking up with her on her birthday. Whedon had read the book. The two of them had talked about the book. They had talked about the epilogue in specific, and I'll let the quote from Lee sum this up.
If he was like, what could I do to Arden that would be her worst nightmare? That would have been it. Joss destroyed a beautiful thing just to show he had the power to. That's literally everything you need to know about him.
So, remember what I said about the power dynamics in the workplace earlier? Well, another thing that can contribute to an unbalanced power dynamic is an age gap. Not automatically, but often, and I feel at this point the need to point out that at the time of these 3 relationships, all these women were in their early 20s and Whedon was in his late 40s, actually crossing over into his 50s during the relationship with Arden.
I get older, they stay the same age.
Yes, they do. Go.
Yes, they do.
And now we arrive at the big deal, the project over which everything came apart. Justice League. As stated earlier, Snyder's departure was not an issue forced by the studio. Snyder himself has said since then that in the wake of his daughter's death, he just had no drive to continue the project. It's a passion he would later rediscover, and that ultimately yielded the Snyder Cut of Justice League. But at the time, while the official company line from Warner Brothers was that Whedon was simply coming in to complete Snyder's work, the choice of Whedon already sounded alarm bells for a lot of folks. No matter what one feels about the man's work, there is absolutely no denying the fact that he and Snyder have very different sensibilities, both in general and in regards to superheroes in specific. It's very clear that Snyder voluntarily opted out of the driver's seat, and Warner Brothers wanted the man behind the mega success of the Avengers to come in and fix the project. Warner Brothers is still denying that this is the case, but the extensive 40 days of reshoots, including massive script and dramatic tone changes, would indicate otherwise. Fixing Justice League is something Whedon was willing to attempt and now openly regrets, though how much of that regret is over the project itself and how much of it is due to the fallout we are about to go further into is anybody's guess. Now, To a certain extent, some degree of tension on set was going to be almost inevitable. Though Whedon had been a script doctor in his early days, as a director, he'd never been brought in to bring somebody else's vision to life, only ever his own. So a cast, crew, and vision brought together under another creator, to say nothing of one as different to Whedon as Snyder is, was always going to be an awkward fit for a man used to being in creative control from the start of any given project. But the reports of what happened on set go beyond just new management growing pains. A rather significant part of the tension appears to stem from the fact that Snyder had approached the writing of the characters as a collaboration with his actors. It's been reported that Snyder frequently let the actors rewrite their lines and guide the characterization. This gave the actors a sense of ownership and a voice in the characters they may not have had under other directors. In contrast, Whedon is and always has been a "you say the line exactly as I wrote it" kind of filmmaker. Now, one approach is not inherently better than the other, but the two definitely do not work going from one to the other in a single film production. And that drastic shift in creative atmosphere seems to have been at the heart of a lot of the things that we're gonna get into. As noted before, the first person to speak about Whedon's on-set demeanor was Ray Fisher. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Fisher had the most riding on Justice League from the get-go. The rest of the cast all had established careers to varying degrees, and Gal Gadot already had the first Wonder Woman movie under her belt. But this was Fisher's first film role. I mean, unless you want to count the cameo/in-movie trailer from Batman v Superman, and I'm not inclined to, personally. It wouldn't be surprising that a result of that is that he was the most personally invested of all the lead stars. He quickly found his part not only being rewritten, but also cut down and minimized. It was cited in The Hollywood Reporter not long ago that when Fisher tried to voice his concerns for the direction the character of Cyborg was taking, Whedon responded by saying he didn't take notes from anybody, not even Robert Downey Jr. Things appeared to only have gotten worse from there. After the shoot had wrapped, Fisher went on to go public with his grievances against Whedon and the Warner Brother executives that he claimed coddled and enabled Whedon's behavior. We don't actually know as many details about the clash between them as you would think, given that there were two internal investigations at Warner Brothers, ultimately resulting in remedial action being taken, though what that actually means remains unclear. Though Fisher was the first to speak out, he was not the only one. Gal Gadot would go on to say that Whedon threatened to make her career miserable for the trouble she was giving him over rewrites that she objected to. When Shapiro brought these things up to Whedon, this is where the quotes that caused the most consternation on Twitter and some other places were said. Whedon made a general statement that he doesn't threaten people, which is something that numerous previous remarks from others over the years would dispute. And add to that, an unnamed actress from Angel who did speak with Shapiro, when this actress's agent tried to get her a pay raise, she said that Whedon called her at home and told her that she would never work for him or 20th Century Fox ever again. And when this actress was told about Gadot's recounting of events and the threatening of her career, the actress commented,
Wow, he's still using that line.
In regards to Gadot specifically, Whedon claimed she must have misunderstood him and his meaning. Or more accurately, he said this:
English is not her first language, and I tend to be annoyingly flowery in my speech.
Okay, this is where I'm done being nice. First of all, he's talking about a woman who's been acting in English-speaking films since 2009. Secondly, how condescendingly dismissive to claim a simple whoopsie lost in translation issue when things like his tone and body language would have made his intent all the more clear to her. And yes, such a lovely dash of casual racism. It's not her first language. She doesn't understand. Bless her heart.
What the hell, man? What the actual hell?
Gadot was asked about this interpretation of events by New York Magazine, and she replied in an email by saying,
I understood perfectly.
Now, as bad as that was, you'll notice that Whedon is denying things while still keeping to his earlier tactic of not actually accusing anybody of lying. Not that it's actually helping his case, but I just wanted to note that before we get to his responses to questions about Ray Fisher. It's Whedon's assertion that Fisher's role was cut down because the script and the character as written didn't really work and Fisher's acting was bad. Now, Whedon also cast doubt over Fisher's motives for speaking out with this statement.
We're talking about a malevolent force. We're talking about a bad actor in both senses.
What?
Okay, two things about this. Firstly, Fisher's quality as a performer is not at issue here. It may have been at issue when script changes were being made, but the major issues that Fisher brought up were Whedon's behavior, not the simple act of being cut back for his part. And even if Fisher was terrible in the role, which his performance in the Snyder Cut would dispute, but let's not get too hung up on that. Even if that was the case, it wouldn't justify the kind of behavior Fisher and others described in terms of how Whedon behaved on set, which again, we've since learned is pretty consistent with behavior over the course of his entire professional career. So regardless of the accuracy, the dig on Fisher's acting ability is irrelevant and unwarranted. Secondly, let's unpack the second meaning of bad actor. In this context, it would mean a person acting in bad faith or being deliberately deceptive. And through all of his weak-ass and even condescending denials that we've gotten from Whedon up to this point, this is the first time he has brought the motive of the other person into question. And there are two key differences that we have between Ray Fisher and the other people that Whedon has been giving responses about. Firstly, Ray Fisher is a man, which I normally wouldn't consider a factor, except given Whedon's deeply tarnished image as a feminist, he may have been more cautious about talking about women, lest that get thrown back in his face. But the second difference is that Fisher is black. All of the women that are named in the article, since we can't confirm for any of the unnamed sources, they are varying degrees of light-skinned, the only possible gray area being Godot, who's Israeli. But regardless of whether or not anyone wants to argue whether that particular heritage does or doesn't qualify her as a person of color, nobody would look at her and think of her as being black. Now, am I saying that Whedon calling into question the motives of the only black man mixed up in all this, when his comments on everyone else were varying degrees of soft or waffly, does that make him racist? I'm not saying that, but I'm also not going to say he definitely isn't either. What this is at best is a deeply bad look, where the speaker didn't stop to think about how what he was saying was going to come across. That is the most generous that I can be when looking at all his statements and realizing he effectively went, I don't recall the things those young white women are saying that I did. It doesn't seem correct to me. That Israeli woman must have been mistaken about my meaning because of the way that I speak and English not being your first language. But that black man? No, he's lying. And what's worse, the bad actor comment, focusing on that second duplicitous meaning, opens up a can of worms that Whedon doesn't know how to handle, because the instant you take the position that somebody is a bad actor, the immediate question is why? Because people make bad faith arguments for reasons, for motive. And this is where we have to bring in some of the ugliness that has been going on in fandoms over all of this. Because when Fisher first spoke out, remembering he was initially the only one talking about the set of Justice League, defenders of Whedon's honor began floating some very conspiratorial narratives, which the article itself points out. These included completely unfounded theories that Fisher was secretly doing this at the bidding of Zack Snyder, or that Snyder had somehow tricked Fisher into thinking Whedon's behavior was racist in order to rile him up and get him to speak out that would in some way lend more credence to the entire release the Snyder Cut movement. Which, Okay, this is such bullshit, but real quick. One, this is the kind of absolute batshit conspiratorial nonsense that has been floating all over fandoms lately. It's the same general mindset that claimed Disney was bribing critics to badmouth Batman v Superman. It's inane nonsense, but more insidiously is point two. These people wouldn't even grant Fisher the agency of his own convictions. This upset black man isn't smart or proactive enough to do this on his own. He must be doing it as somebody's bidding, or because he's just a brainless patsy. Oh, and as a bonus, when this kind of bizarre conspiracy narrative was making the rounds, these same folks also argued that Charisma Carpenter was swayed by the negative press into seeing a complicated working relationship as simply being abusive. So let's add attempted gaslighting onto the conspiratorial crap pile. Look, I'm sorry for bringing up this kind of disgusting nonsense, but seriously, fandoms, this has to stop. Now, the thing is, these theories were making the rounds among Whedon's defenders. They weren't being espoused by Whedon himself, or at least they weren't up to now, because while Whedon never affirms a belief in any of these narratives specifically, nor does he state these wild theories on motive, he did say this.
I don't know who started it. I just know in whose name it was done.
And that implies a lot. And what it implies is dark and leans into the most toxic inclinations of modern fandom. And the thing is, Whedon really should know that. Because the simple fact is that many of Snyder's fans assaulted Whedon relentlessly online and in forums. And it only got worse as everything about him came out. So Whedon is fully aware. We know he knows this happened because of this.
The beginning of the internet raised me up, and the modern internet pulled me down. The perfect symmetry is not lost on me.
That he could be aware enough to recognize all that, yet not aware enough to realize that even implying devious motives to Fisher's actions is going to lead to worse things happening in terms of his fans going after Fisher. The fact that he doesn't realize that is infuriating. Although then again, that's me being generous. It is distinctly possible he is fully aware and just doesn't care. There are a few more direct quotes from Whedon that I want to bring up because I think they matter, but they didn't fit properly into the sections of this video as I was laying it out. Whedon really seems to want to trace his woes back to 2017 and the publishing of Kay Cole's open letter about their marriage.
I was made a target by my ex-wife, and people exploited that cynically. She put out a letter saying some bad things I'd done and saying some untrue things about me, but I had done the bad things, and so people knew I was gettable.
Again, there's a bit of a conspiratorial bent to this. And it's also a bit of an odd claim in terms of the timeline of events, because it would be 3 years between the publication of the letter and Fisher speaking out. So the idea that Cole's letter waved a signal flag that everybody responded to doesn't line up. In a similar vein, there's this quote.
Once someone lights a fuse and people see there's a flame, they run to it and throw stuff into it.
Now, I won't deny there's a certain amount of truth in that, broadly speaking. It's certainly been true in the wake of things like Me Too, where the first person to speak out about misconduct has a tendency to open the floodgates for those who have been hesitant to speak out before. The thing about that, though, is even if they only came to throw things on the fire after the fuse was lit, they have things to throw. It's not nothing. Not being public with these kinds of issues in the past does not negate the truth of the matter, which is something that has become increasingly evident in the film and television business specifically, where moving against the wrong person gets your career ended, such as Whedon himself allegedly threatened to do to multiple people. I will never stop being annoyed at the, oh, look at all these people saying stuff about me now that I'm vulnerable tactic, because it doesn't address the fact that these people have stories to share, and the reason they do is because of you and your actions. But, as noted, Whedon wasn't totally devoid of self-critique in his own way.
Could I have done marriage better? Don't get me started. Could I have been a better showrunner? Absolutely. Should I have been nicer?
I didn't cut that quote short. He did stop there initially. And after thinking about it, and in light of the fact that he has at least tacitly admitted to being heated or harsh or misunderstood in the moment, he felt that this was the answer he wanted to give.
I think I'm one of the nicer showrunners that's ever been.
Nice execution.
You're doing terrific.
I can't imagine this article is going to do anything to rehabilitate Whedon's image in the public or in the industry. I'd honestly be surprised if he's granted the kind of budget and support he'd been getting from entities like Marvel or even HBO anytime soon, if ever again. It's not necessarily that it's because the accusations against him are the worst in the industry. They're very much not, bad as they are. But rather, it's because unlike folks like, say, Gina Carano, James Gunn, Amber Heard, whose actions were all offset, the controversy about Whedon has to do with his behavior on the job itself. Folks in Hollywood not wanting to employ him isn't just a PR thing. It's about not wanting to work with someone whose actual on-set conduct is at the heart of the problem. That's not to say we'll never hear from him again. Independent studios, even self-financing, it's still a thing. But it's going to take years of him working small scale with no issues before he'd even have a prayer of getting a big canvas to work on again. If that's even possible, and it may not be. As for his legacy, well, now that we have stories about his conduct going all the way back to Buffy, his legacy is definitely tarnished. But it's going to be up to each individual viewer to decide on how that impacts their love of his work. Speaking personally, I don't actually plan to get rid of my complete Buffy box set, but I also don't plan to rewatch it anytime soon, if ever. I mean, I'm kind of sentimental that way. Heck, I actually still have my Harry Potter related stuff, my Slytherin gear. It's all packed away, so I don't have to look at it, but I haven't had it in me to actually throw it out because I remember what it meant to me in the past, and that still means something. Now, Whedon's earlier work had been getting a critical reassessment even before all this blew up, so I'm not about to call even his best work flawless. Things like Buffy that were viewed as progressive in their day have looked less so as times have moved on, but there could still be value there. Though I would want to caution people about letting their love of his work turn them into defenders of him as a person. Conversely, it also throws me off when people who demonize Whedon as a person feel it's also necessary to argue that his work was never any good. Both of these positions, that liking art means defending the artist or that a bad person's art must also be bad, they seem to stem from a core idea that only good people make good art, and that has literally never been true. What I want everybody on all sides of this thing to remember is this. Somebody can be your creative hero without also having to be your personal hero. And no, that's not the same thing as separate the artist from the art. I've said my piece about why that doesn't work. Rather, what I'm saying is you are allowed to evaluate the work and the person individually. Their value does not have to correlate. You can dislike one and like the other. Ian from Passion of the Nerd, who I do consider a friend and is continuing to do excellent work with episode-by-episode deep dives of Whedon's work, addressed this very well in a recent comment response. I'd advise you to pause and give it a full read. While I've made the choice to disengage from works that feel the most uniquely Whedon, like Buffy, Angel, and Firefly, I was already fine not revisiting Dollhouse, I'm pretty much mirroring Ian's approach when it comes to Whedon's contributions to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm not about to pack away my copy of The Avengers, partly because it's easier for me to see the contributions of the actors and the crew who were already in place and would have been there making the movie regardless of whether Whedon did it or somebody else. But, I mean, that's where I'm at. You may be somewhere else, but no matter what, boy, would he have been better off just not saying anything. So, that is everything I have to say about the article on Joss Whedon and his comments contained therein. It's a lot to deal with, and it's never fun, and it's never pleasant. But I have been making the argument that it is responsible entertainment consumption to grapple with these things, and it is irresponsible to ignore them. And I try to live up to my own standards to the best of my ability. What are your thoughts on this? I do ask, I know this is heated, and I know I certainly am not feeling kindly towards Whedon. Try to avoid name-calling and base or gross personal attacks. I will delete those comments. But if you can keep that restrained, then I want to hear what your thoughts are on this. Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments, and let's talk about it. Patreon is what keeps this entire operation up and running and allows me to do what you just saw me do. Any amount of support is helpful. There's also YouTube memberships. Link down in the description for the Patreon, as well as for all the other stuff I do. Twitch, Instagram, TikTok, etc., etc. But don't worry too much about it. At the end of the day, my friends, you are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Thanks for sticking around into the credits. None of this would have been possible without my Patreon supporters in particular. I want to thank Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Robin Moore, Shayla Gourlay, and Bookworm. Thanks for keeping this going. And to everybody,